Hello, I'm Llewellyn Falco, and we are here for unit testing Asp.Mvc Views, which is something that's not normally talked about. Before we get going, I just want to give you a little bit of background on a couple things about the webinar itself. So the first thing is questions. There are actually two ways you can ask questions. A very easy way is just tweet something with the Developmentor. All of us will be watching, and we'll pick up questions from the Twitter feed that way. Also gives you an easier way to interact with each other. The other way is in the GoToMeeting webinar itself, there's this task questions. We can just type directly in there. Joining me today also, I'm going to have another Developmentor instructor, Lynn Langett.
Hi everyone, I'm Lynn Langett, and actually Llewellyn and I are coming to you on this webinar from Los Alamos, New Mexico. We're actually on vacation. Crazy, huh? The sound you hear in the background is hummingbirds as we overlook a beautiful canyon. So we'll try to keep the distractions to a minimum, focus on testing, and tweet those questions out on Twitter to #Developmentor.
All right. And with that, let's get started. So the first question is why test? And it turns out there's a lot of different answers to these questions. Hopefully you already have an answer, and that's why you're showing up to the webinar in the first place. It turns out there's 4 benefits to unit testing, and we're going to touch on all of them throughout this webinar, but I want to start with the third benefit, which a lot of people consider the main benefit, which is regression. And the idea in regression is I used to get A, I want to continue to get A. It's a very simple concept, and it's what a lot of people mean when they say unit tests. But what does that mean? Like, what does that mean when you apply it to an ASP page or an MVC page? Well, very simply, it means I used to get this web page. I want to still get this web page. But this is a little bit misleading because what you're seeing here isn't just the web page. It's rendered in the browser. It's a lot of different things, and it can be different depending on browsers. So we want to be a little more specific than just the image of the page. What we want is the code behind the page, the HTML that's being generated from your MVC page. And this is a paradigm of testing. It's a paradigm called golden master testing. The idea is at some point in time, we as humans have said, this is what I want. And the test is supposed to rerun the situation and confirm that what it is getting matches what we said was okay. And we're going to talk about using this paradigm of testing to unit test our MVC pages and our MVC views. I'm going to go through a very simple demo first to get us started, and I'm going to use something called ApprovalTests as well. Now this is not the unit test library that I'm going to use. This is a verification library that sits under it. For this demo, I'm going to use MS Test, which is the default unit testing that comes with Microsoft and Visual Studio. But you can use this with anything, XUnit, NUnit, MBUnit, doesn't matter.
Now again, if you're new to unit testing, I just want to let our audience know that ApprovalTests, as Llewellyn said, is an open source library that works actually not only with .NET and different frameworks, but other languages as well. And if people want to explore more about ApprovalTests, there's a couple ways, because you might be curious, because we're kind of going to the advanced section here. So what's the URL to the ApprovalTest site, Llewellyn?
Well, ApprovalTest.com, and we'll put all these links as well as other videos that you can watch at the end of the session. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to start with a very simple thing to test, which is static pages. So we're going to use Asp.Mvc, but we're going to generate a static page. In this case, we're going to generate the About page. Now, if you want to follow along with my code, of course, we're going to have the video. You can also check out the code here on GitHub. You can go there and actually just point GitHub for Windows there, or you can go and download the zip and play along at home. So let's jump into the code. So I have a simple Asp.Mvc app here. I'm just going to run it. You can see it's working here. I'm going to start with this About box. So here I am not logged in, looking at my About packs, you can see this is my lovely static page. And we're going to use this golden master paradigm to test this. And so the first thing is, I really need to know what this URL is. What is the page that I'm going to get? So I'm going to copy that URL, and I'm going to go to my test. Now, let's stop the debugger. There's a couple things we need to add to our test project first. Well, actually only one thing. I'm going to go and I'm going to go to NuGet. If you haven't used NuGet already, it's an absolutely fantastic way to handle package management. You can search on it. So I'm going to go online and search for ApprovalTests. And then you can install straight from there. And all that's doing is adding the DLL to your references. Once I've done that, I'm going to start, and we're going to talk about MVC, but MVC is sort of harnessed under ASP anyways. And so I'm going to start by testing using just a very simple method of this static page. So I'm going to use the ASP approvals, and I'm going to verify a URL. And that URL is the exact one that I just loaded in the web browser. Now, ApprovalTests works better when you use something called reporters. We're going to talk about this a lot more, but I'm going to go up here and say use reporter and just a type of tortoise diff reporter. And that's my entire test right now. It's just a static page, and static pages are very simple. But I haven't yet said what the golden master is. And so that's what I'm about to do right here. So I'm going to click here and say run. I'm going to get the HTML that comes out of that page. It's over here on the receive side. Over here on the golden master side, you'll notice it's still empty because I've never said it was okay. So I'm going to move this entire thing over and say, yes, this is okay. I'll save that. And if I rerun my test, you'll see that it passes. You can tell that by the green bar here and the pretty successes down here. Just to prove to you that this really is doing what we want it to do, I'm going to go to my view, open that up, and just change something. Now I'm going to go back to my unit test sessions. Oh, I should mention, I'm using MS Test, which is the standard runner that comes with Visual Studio, but I'm not using the runner from Visual Studio. I'm using Resharper's runner right now. That's actually doesn't matter. I can run this in either thing. I'll just do that right now to test you, but I actually like this runner more, so I'm going to use it throughout the webcast. So here I'm just going to hit a Control-R and a T to run it through MS Test, which you can see down here at the bottom. It's also going to launch this differ to show, hey, something changed. It changed here on line 29, and it used to be a period. Now it's a exclamation mark.
So Llewellyn, I see a question coming in asking about the diff tool that you're using. Is this something that, again, you're using so many different components, and people might be new to this. So what parts are in Visual Studio? Can you go over the parts one more time so people can understand what you're working with?
Absolutely. So the first part is the actual unit test framework that we're using in general. And that is the Microsoft Visual Studio test tools. That's MS Test. The next part is, now that you have that, we need to verify underneath it. That's ApprovalTests, and you're seeing that down here on the verify URL. I need to run that test, and I have two options on how I can run that test. I can run it down here in Microsoft's MS Test Runner, which comes with Visual Studio, or I can run it up here in Resharper's Test Runner. Doesn't change the underlying framework, it's just a question of how you run it. I personally prefer this one because of stuff like the green bar, which this one is missing. After that, it's going to open the page. And I can open that in a variety of different methods. Right now, I'm using Tortoise diff, the Tortoise diff tool, which comes with Tortoise SVN. There's a whole bunch of different ways I can do this. For example, I can just use the regular diff reporter, which will open it in something called Beyond, or not Beyond Compare, sorry, there is a Beyond Compare reporter as well if you are Beyond Compare And this is using Code Compare, which actually opens inside of Visual Studio. If you're using Visual Studio 2012, there's a diff compare is part of the editor that it will open in. You can also use stuff like WinMerge or KDiff or whatever diff tool you want. I think that's all the different parts that we're using here. And again, in either way that you show it, it's going to show you what's changed. So I'm going to go back to my About page, put it back so I know that I haven't changed anything, and run my test to show that it works.
So again, while this is running, just so the audience can understand what they've seen, what you've done is so that they can understand how approval tests work and the different tools that you're using, you've taken a case that wouldn't be the sort of the central part of this. You're building up to it. You're starting with the static page, and you're going to be adding the complexity as you go.
Exactly. And it's worth noting, just again to sort of show what's occurring here, that golden master is being held right here next to your test as the name of the class, home controller test, the name of the test, about, and then the approved file. And I'll go and I'll actually check this all in to GitHub. Completed static page test. Okay. So that's nice, but it's not nearly good enough. There's a whole bunch of things about this I don't like, starting with the fact that I have this icky static string sitting right here. If things changes, if route changes, there's a lot of maintenance that gets put into here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of the fact that we're in MVC. I'm going to use the MVC approvals, and I'm going to say verify the MVC page. Now this is actually going to be identical to the line above. It's just going to be a lot more maintainable and a lot easier to use. So what I'm going to say is I need a new home controller. And I'm not going to actually call the about. I'm going to pass a delegate to the about. Now, most of the time, the reason that you pass delegates around in your code is because you want to execute them later. But that is not the case with this delegate. In this case, you're passing the delegate around simply so that approvals can get the information and reconstruct this query above it. So I'm going to comment this out and run this. And it should pass, but it doesn't pass. And it doesn't pass because I haven't configured everything I need right now. If you actually read the test or the failure message down here, it'll point that I have not set the port. If we look at the test, this makes a little bit of sense. It's easy to figure out the home, the about, but it's really hard to figure out this port 50011. Actually, I should point out that I kind of cheated a little bit ahead of time. We set a static page, and this indeed was a static page. But the way that Cassini runs in general is even if the page is static, the port is usually set or auto-assigned. So I went to the properties here and set it to be a specific port, thereby making it an actual static page.
I see a question coming in. So the question is, does the use of your library with MVC require that you use Cassini, or can you use a full IIS test implementation?
You can use a full IIS. You can use IIS Express. There's also a very useful tool called Cassini Develop? No, Cassini Dev, sorry. In the video links that we post, we'll show how to use some of those as well in those videos. We're not going to go into that today because we really want to focus on the testing part. But yes, you can use different environments for your hosting. Cassini is very easy though and comes with Visual Studio. So how am I going to reconstruct this with this thing? Well, the error message itself tells you. So let's go to that and copy directly from it. And I'll go back to my home controller test and say, hey, this equals 50011. And now if I run my test, we'll see it pass. And so now I don't need to have these sort of magic strings lying about. And I can also do things like I can do renames and they'll work. I can use my link controls and those will work as well. And this is better. But it isn't good enough. I don't want to have to keep maintaining this port all the places, and it's really kind of ancillary to my test. Now it makes sense that you might want to put this in the init part of your test. We're going to have multiple different tests, and so what I tend to do is have this extend an MVC test. Now this is not a class that is there for me. This is a class I'm going to have to create. So I'm going to create that right now using Resharper. And inside of here, I'm going to create my constructor, and inside of there, I'm going to take my port moving and move it into here.
I see another question coming up. Now, you used Resharper there. Again, because you're using so many different tools here, questions are coming in about which tools are optional, which tools are required.
Resharper is definitely an optional tool, though I enjoy it quite a lot. There is a class generator in Visual Studio itself if you hit the control dot when you don't have a class. Or, of course, you could always hand code these up. Totally optional, cool, just makes development a lot easier. And once you start getting more testing in place, you'll want to take advantage of the power of refactoring using tools. Whether you use Resharper, DevExpress, or the built-in stuff from Visual Studio, you're going to want to start making your code a lot more malleable. Tests are going to give you the safety around that, and they're going to start wanting to use the power to change your code once you have that safety. Next, just to keep this a little bit cleaner, I don't really care about this MVC test, so I want to get it out of my vision. So I'm just going to move it to its own file. Again, using Resharper to do that. So now, when I go to my test, you can see that I'm really only focusing on the one thing I care about. I wanted to unit test the About page on my home controller. I'm going to run that one more time just to make sure that everything is still working as it should be. And I'll do one more commit here. Created MVC test base class. All right. So let's go back to our slides. Static pages. Bam, those are done. As you can see, there's a page out there. All you have to do is go, call it, and save the results, and then in the future, confirm that the results are what you got before. But a lot of you might be asking, so what? I mean, come on. You're not going to use an MVC application to do static pages. I mean, sure, you might have one or two static pages, but you're not going to have a whole app of static pages, and honestly, the static pages aren't the ones that we really care about. But they're easy, and that's important, because I'm about to show you another trick for the non-static pages, and that is reduce to static. I have a diagram here that sort of will walk you through it. Let's say you have a static page. Yes, well that's easy. We just saw how to do that. But what if you don't have a static page? Well, that's very hard. Well, then you should reduce it to static. We'll come back here and say, do we have a static page? And now the answer is yes, and it's easy again. So you might be thinking, what? Like that's just cheating. And it is. But most of what you do in unit testing is some sort of cheating. In fact, most of what we do in programming is some sort of cheating. You just have to learn to cheat well. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, first, let me show you the page that we're going to use. We have this About page, and this is static. But we also have a status page. The status page is going to give us information for customers. So here you can see I'm passing in customer len, it's going to the database, gathering the information that we need, and displaying it. This is a non-static page. This is stuff that I might actually really care about, how it's presented, how it looks. Now I should mention that all the CSS and images are being displayed here. I just am not using them because it turns out I have very little style sense. But if you did have it, it would be here, it would be displayed. That is what we were seeing before when we see here. That style sense was given to me by Microsoft. Now, I said that the way to do this is to cheat, and I'm going to show you how to cheat properly. But before I show you that, I want to show you how to cheat dirty. Now, this is not what I would suggest for normal unit tests, but a lot of you might be here saying, I have this body of code right now that I need to get under test so I can clean it up. And the stuff I'm about to show you might take a little more effort than you want to start with. It definitely is the case for me. I don't know if you know, but almost every Developmentor instructor spends about half their time in production code. It's a really important way that we keep our skills sharp and don't become just academic. And so a lot of times my production code is going to rescue projects. They have ugly code. And sometimes the steps that I want to show you right now are going to take me a couple steps to get to. So here's a cheat that I used since I have a database expert sitting right next to me. So I called once and said, hey, I have this ugly thing. I don't know what to do with it. I can't reproduce it in a consistent way. And this is what I learned. So here is Studio Management Studio. You can see here's the database that we're using. If I was to turn this off, this page would fail. But if I want this just to become a static page, you can go in here to Properties, go to your Options, and scroll down. You'll see Database Read Only. If you change this from false to true, you will get a static page. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Do not do this in your production database. Just to be equally clear, you should not be testing or running against a production database anyways. But I definitely do not want people calling me saying, hey, Llewellyn said it was okay to change our production database to read-only. That is not okay. Testing against your production database is not okay either. If you do not already have a database that is specifically set up for your test and dev environments, copy your production database and start there. That is not a great way to go, but it is a better way to go than going against production. Ideally, you want to sanitize and clean up all that data as well. But in your test database, turning it to false is a very easy way to make a static page. And that will allow you to clean and refactor and get to the things I'm about to show you in safety. And then you can turn it back to being non-read-only at the end of the day after you've done these cleanings. All right. So now,
and just for a point of clarity, since I am the person who gave Llewellyn this tip, it's SQL Server Management Studio. So
yes.
Developers, use developer tools, and database people use database tools. So I just want to be clear on that. Of course, if you're using a database other than SQL Server, there are usually command line ways to make the database be read-only, but just easy to do it in Management Studio.
Yeah. All right, so let's go here and take a look at the page that we're about to test, the status. Okay, so as we said, this is not a static page. This is a page that goes against your database. And I want to talk a little bit about how I would normally test this, because I think that viewpoint is really important, because we're not going to follow it. And it's good to acknowledge it and understand why we're not going to follow it. So when you're testing a view, and it turns out I see this mistake over and over whether you're doing MVC or not, you tend to have some sort of test script that looks like this. I have some views, and then I do all this stuff, and then I get a new view. If we were to look at the page we were just on, obviously before I did this, I had to create the customer len, I had to create these orders, I had to ship some orders, I had to not ship some orders so that this page could be done. And most test scripts will include that so that we always get to the same place. Of course, there's a whole bunch of information underneath here, right? Every time you press or click or type or select, you're interacting with the view, which is usually changing the model, updating it, sometimes hitting a database, going through some business logic, creating a new model, which is then being rendered once again. That's a lot of stuff. And these are really much more integration tests, which is not what we're doing right now. What we want to do is a unit test. And that means we need to get rid of a lot of this stuff. And we're only going to focus on, circle went away. We're only going to focus on getting the model and getting the view. Oh, there it is back. Sorry about that. So we're going to get the model and we're going to render it. So if I clean this up a little bit, put it in like the language of Spec Flow, and I'll say, given a model, when I render that model against the view, I need to verify the result. All right. Oh, wait. And again, just for those who are visually minded, it's going to be model plus view equals result.
Okay, earlier, again, we have a question about Spec Flow. What is Spec Flow? Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So in the testing world, there's this entire culture of behavior-driven development. And behavior-driven development has a lot of things, but one aspect to that culture is the idea that it's important how we say things, that the language that we use actually influences the thoughts that we have. And so Spec Flow is an implementation against a Ruby project ported over into .NET that allows you to spec out your test in language that a business person could understand. Right? It's not always the case. In fact, it's usually not the case that the business person can write the Spec Flow tests, but it is the case that they can always read them. And they usually follow this given, when, then. Right? In this case, we're using the given, when, verify syntax. All right. So we're going to reduce this to a static page. We're going to start by saying status is not static. So let's go to our test, and let's make a new test method. We're going to test the static version of status. And so I'm going to need MVC Approvals again, and I'm going to need to verify the page. I'm going to need a new home controller, and I'm going to call test static version of status. Again, this is a delegate, not an actual call, but it still doesn't exist, so I'm going to need to make that method. So now I have a static page as part of my test. This is going to feel a little awkward, and we're going to clean it up a lot. So I'm going to ask for a little bit of patience before you feel comfortable with this. It takes a while, and even I am not fully comfortable with the end result right now, but it is the best thing that we've been able to do. So here we have the static version. And basically what I want to do is call status. Now, it would be simple to say, hey, let me call status and just pass it len. But that doesn't quite work because it still goes through our database and all our things. In fact, if we look here on these two lines that make up this part where I get the person, this is the line that's causing me trouble. This is the part that's my real integration. This is the part that hits my database. And so I'm going to use a technique called the peel. This is just a very simple way of taking something that is troublesome and breaking it up so that it's no longer troublesome. And so what I have represented here is a single method. Each of these lines represents lines in the method. And the red ones are the troublesome methods. And so I'm going to do a simple extract method underneath of all the easy stuff so that I have, instead of one method that's hard, two methods. One that's very small but hard, and one that's big that I want to test but is easy. And then I'm going to ignore the hard one. So let's see this in action. This is the hard part. This is the easy part. Let's grab that. I'm going to use Resharper here to extract a method. Now I have a status that takes a customer. And so now here, I can pass in my test situation. I cannot spell very well. And again, I'll just create a local variable here. And now I need to set up my, so I'm going to say, set up test situation. And I'm going to pull that out as a method. Now, this is a little bit more complicated. So I made a snippet. So you don't have to watch me type the whole thing. But I will go through this and actually talk about it. And I would write my code in this manner, where I isolate out my tests so it's very easy to read. And then I put the bulk of this setup thing in a nice convenience method. This also gives me the chance to use it and reuse the setup with other places. So all I'm doing here is I'm using my entity framework objects, but I'm not connecting them to the database. I'm not connecting it to an entity store. I'm just creating them. They're real objects. They're not mocks. It's fake data with real objects, but it's not touching the database. It's not going through the database. We're not even mocking out the database. The PL has created a seam within our code that allows us to easily inject the dependency that we care about. A lot of times when you talk about dependency injection, people think frameworks. And dependency injection frameworks are very powerful and robust things. There's a whole level of dependency injection. Really, the concept of that pattern is polymorphism and putting in a different object. We're doing dependency injection here through parameterization. Very, very simple form. So simple that people don't normally even acknowledge it as a form. So I've created this customer, Lynn. I've created an invoice with an item, another invoice with an item, another invoice with 2 items, and a third invoice, a fourth invoice, yes, with 2 more items as well. And now I have a static page. And just to ensure that it's actually coming from here, not the database, I'm going to use hiking boots as our, oh, you actually won't see that one. I'm going to use hiking boots in the middle one as well. So you should see hiking boots show up in this page. So now let's go back to our test. And I need to talk a little bit about feedback. I'm going to run this first so you can see what happens. Oh, the build has failed. Oh yeah, sorry. That's what happens with snippets. You forget to actually return your customer. And one other, well, okay, we'll do this first and run it. You're going to see an error occur. You're going to see a couple errors occur. We'll walk through what they actually are. So when you're doing this at home, you'll have the same experience. So you can see the first one worked, but the second one threw an exception. And when I click here, you'll see the details of that exception. And the first problem is this 500 error. If I want to get more information about this, because it's a static page, I can actually just launch the page. And you can see test static view of the view is not found. Now you might be saying, I don't want a view for that. And indeed, I don't want a view for that. And I created the view here in my status. And shouldn't that mean that I'm looking for a view as a status? And the answer is yes, it should, but no, it doesn't. Because the way MVC attaches the default page is on front, and it doesn't know which method originally called it. it knows which method it was called with. So there's two ways that you can fix this. The first is you can hard code right here. It's status. Now when I run it, it's not going to try to replace the null value. And you'll get an actual result that comes in. We'll talk about this result in just a second. I want to show you another way to do it. Well, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so let me run that again. We're using the in-browser compare because that's the last one we set it to. And you can see we got this information. The good news is we do see hiking boots, but I have no idea if this looks like what I want it to look like because I'm not very good at parsing HTML in my head. The last one we didn't have to worry about. We had already seen it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about another aspect of unit testing. I said there was 4. Mainly we've just been looking at regression right now. We saw a little bit of granularity when the test failed before, and we saw the exclamation mark as opposed to the period. But granularity and feedback are 2 very important parts of testing. And even if you don't do traditional unit testing, most programmers I know set up some way that they can manually run stuff to see that their code is working while they develop it. Unit tests give you a more effective and more efficient way to do that. But during this part, before you have gotten it to work as you want, you're going to want feedback. And that comes down to an aspect in approval tests called reporters. And in fact, you can think of the diagram like this. When you do something, so all tests have 2 parts. You do something and then you verify it. When you verify it, if it passes, you're done. You don't care. But if you fail, then you want some more information. Think about any test you've ever gotten back, right? You might have gotten 99 questions right, but that one that you got wrong, now that's the one you go and you look at. This extra looking at it, this extra feedback sometimes takes some extra time, sometimes doesn't. In this case, it's going to take a little extra time because we're actually going to render it in a browser. So to do that, we're going to go up here to our test. And we have 2 options. One is we could do it, instead of a diff reporter, we could do it in a FileLauncher Reporter, which will launch in browser. The other option is I could do both. So I'm going to do the FileLauncher Reporter and I'm going to go back to the Tortoise diff reporter. So now I'm going to use both reporters. I'm going to run this again. Here's the diff reporter, which is not helping me at this moment, but here's the FileLauncher Reporter. Here's the report. Now this is not going against the database. You can see the hiking boots in here. And in fact, at this point, I'm actually going to go to my database and tell it to stop. So here's the thing. I can see it rendered in the page. I can see that it is in the format that I want. Then, oh, I already closed it. I'm going to run this one more time. I can go to the HTML that I want and approve that. Different ways of increasing my feedback based on how I need to view the results, the extra pieces of information I want. Now that I've gotten it passing, I can run it. Oh. What's happening right now is that Tortoise has decided to add a return when I do not want it. Bugger all. Let's go back to the in-browser.
So I'll just jump in here while Llewellyn is cleaning this up. Just to, for those of you for whom approval tests are new, things that he's showing here at the multiple reporters are not specific to MVC. This is a feature of his library approval tests that you can have multiple reporters or locations. It just happens to be really useful when you're testing MVC.
And now we've reduced this test to a static test. Again, you can go here and you can see the static page is working here. If you look at the URL, this is coming from a file. I can also view the static page directly in the thing. Here I am going against. Wait, how did that work? I obviously did not turn off the database that I thought I did. Stop.
So enter the DBA when you watch them. See, it should be the orders database, isn't it?
It came up with this window up here that I forgot to click.
Yeah, okay.
We'll come back to that after I finish closing down. But what I was actually doing here was the test static version of static, which works. The database should now be off, and if I reload this, you can see it's spinning. It's eventually going to time out and complain to me. All right, so we've now reduced this to a static page, and this is good. We can test it, but it's not good enough. For starters, here I am in my home controller. I'm going to pin this up. And you can see I have a lot of extra code I don't want, and more specifically, I have test code, and I have test code in my production code. That's horrible. But unfortunately, there isn't a better option right now. But there is a better option of where it is in my production code. And so what I'm going to do, you can see here I have this home controller. I'm going to add a new file, new class, called home controller.test. And in this home controller, you can see now, I'll pin these both up here. I'm going to take my original home controller and I'm going to make it a partial class. I'm going to go to here and also make it, rename that .cs. And also make this a partial class. Now, did I spell partial wrong? Oh, I forgot. I overwrote the word class. Sorry. All right, so now I can take this part of my test, which really doesn't belong to be intermixed here, and move it over into my test class. All right. So now I've sort of hidden away my test scenarios, and my production code is clean as we would expect it to be. However, it's still the case that I might not want this test code to go into my actual production system. Now, if it's an internal web app, it really doesn't matter. But if you're doing something and you're pushing it out to the World Wide Web, on top of just being ugly, it's just not a good idea to expose extra information about your system that doesn't need there. It opens attack. It's just not a good idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this entire thing and I'm going to wrap it in an if debug. All right, and then I'm going to move that if debug all the way down to the end. Oh, sorry. If not debug. Yeah, that's right. If debug.
And so in English, what you're doing right now is you're marking out sections of the code to be run only in debug.
Exactly. I've forgotten a specific thing. Let me just check and steal from other places.
While Alon's doing that, I'll just remind everyone that if they have a question, they can tweet it out using the hashtag Developmentor, all one word. We've been answering questions live here during our webcast. I'm testing MVC from beautiful Los Alamos, New Mexico. The hummingbirds have calmed down. So hopefully you don't have too much background noise. We're sitting on a beautiful balcony overlooking. Too bad we don't have a video, but we're not turning it on because we're on vacation. So how are you doing there?
Oh, yeah. So it's capital debug. Sorry,
Okay.
this stupid mistake. But now this code will only be compiled if you're in debug. And when you compile for your release, your test code will not show up as part of your DLL. It's also worth noting that it won't show up for your DLL, but it also won't show up for your release copy of your tests. So you need to put the if statement around your MVC tests as well. Because otherwise your release will not compile, period. And the reason I'm using a release, there's another way of doing this where you can put an attribution of debug on it, conditional. And the problem with that is the Visual Studio is actually smart enough to know that that might be conditional and won't allow you to use a delegate. So you really need to use the hash if. All right, so we've done this. Let me run it again, show that everything is still working. Good. I'm going to do a quick push to GitHub as well. You can see all the things here that have changed. Reduced to static. And now I want to do one last thing just to clean this up. This is a really optional part, but I still don't like the fact that I have this hard-coded piece of text sitting here. If you like that, that's fine. You can keep it. It's no problem at all. But the other way you can do this is you can go here. I'm going to add a reference. And new get reference. I'm going to add approval test here. Now I'm not going to add the whole thing, although that's going to be the first step. You'll see that this is added two DLLs, approval tests and approval utilities. Approval tests is for the testing part. I'm going to take that out. But I'm going to keep approval utilities in my production code. There's lots of nice little convenience functions that just make regular programming day-to-day stuff easier. It also has one for the MVC. It has an extension method on view. And to do that, all you have to do instead is say, hey, this should have been explicit. And that will add the status from the method it's being called from. And so I can run that again and show that everything is still working. Let me just really quickly turn on time so you can see these tests, right? It takes a while to start up, but the second test is running in 0.02 seconds. So even though it's doing a call across, these tests still run very fast. There is, unfortunately, about a 1 second overhead to do that. And just to make things a little bit more cumbersome, the runners themselves have a 4-second overhead on average between when you hit the button and when you actually see a result, even if you have just a very simple page, or just a simple assert, like assert fail. All right, so we've gone through there. We've moved that all up. I'll do one more check-in. Explicit pages. That sounds a lot worse than it is. All right, so we've talked about the feedback. I want to recap through everything that we've gone over, because we've really gone through a lot. First of all, we took the static pages, and we found a way to test them by using a golden master paradigm. That was nice, but it had that icky string. So we moved it to the MVC test, and to do that, we had to add the port, which we removed out into a base class. So we created that base class of the MVC test, which initializes what's the port that we're going to use. Then we created the MVC test that says, go and retrieve this static page. After that, we moved to the reduction to static. we took the pages that are dynamic and put in consistent data so they would create consistent pages. Now, when we did that, we had to put that test controller. We put it in originally as part of just the regular controller, but then we moved it into its own partial class so that it was nice and easy to handle. In and of itself, that's not enough because it had to interact with the original method. And that required that seam, that ability to get in to the method and only make it so it was the model and the view that came together to produce our end result. Then we went and we added the explicit views so we could make it so that it moved with our system. And then finally, we added the release and debug changes around so that we're not taking this test code that unfortunately is in our production code and actually putting it into production. This way it sits in our production code, but it never makes it to production. And this seems like a lot. In fact, we've been sitting here for the last hour going through all of it. But the thing is, once you've done it once, the second time, it's not a lot. I'm going to go back to the code just for a second. If I wanted to test a new page, I would simply write my test here, go to my test controller, and add my method right here. So when I think about testing, I don't think about all these 6 things. You need these 6 things to get started. But once you're started, I see this list like this. I have a test controller in my partial class. What is that going to look like? That's the part that you're going to focus on day in and day out. How do I recreate my scenario so that I get the, how do I create my model so that when I render it with the view, I have a result that is meaningful to me, that is testing the appropriate paths through my view. All right. You'll notice in that view here we have 3 different sections for shipped, unshipped, and partially shipped orders. Therefore, the real thought that goes into that test is how do I construct my customer so that they have orders in each of those categories that I can look at. Again, for those of you who are visually minded, I wanted to take a way to visualize this process. So here I have my unit test, and I have this gray border around it because the unit test actually exists in a separate process. Right? I have the unit test process, but then I also have Cassini, and that's running in its own separate process. So the unit test is going to call out over to TCP/IP stack into the web server for Cassini or whatever web server you happen to be using. It's going to come in through the Asp.Mvc routing. But instead of going to the controller, which would be more of your integration test where you hit the database and get your data, we have placed a test controller alongside it. So you come into the test controller, set up your model, and then continue to the second part of the controller where we render against the view. That's been a whole lot of information that we put into a very short amount of time. I want to give you some extra resources. So as you go and continue to do this, you will have an easier time getting up. We'll have extra details around here. The first is a YouTube link. I'm giving you the shortened version here so it's easy to type. This is another thing going through just the test of the ASP. The bit.ly link underneath it is this video from ASP.Conf, which is a virtual conference that happened just a week or 2 ago. This is an hour-and-a-half video. The first video is about 20 minutes. Also going through this. Now this is going to go into some bigger detail. How do I use this with continuous integration? How do I use it with Cassini Dev, that kind of stuff. It's a longer conference, but a lot more detailed, goes in a bit richer. There's a lot of information also on the ApprovalTests site itself and on the ApprovalTest blog you can get to from that site. And of course, if you really want to delve into not just MVC, but the entire world of not only having unit tests, but doing it in a test-driven fashion, Developmentor offers a 4-day course on that I instruct.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here since I'm also a Developmentor instructor. One of the things that Developmentor does, if you're not familiar, is we have standard outlines, but we deliver in 2 ways. We deliver both at Developmentor offices, well 3 actually, online or at a client site. One thing that we do particularly, and I know in the courses Luan has taught, this has almost always been the case, is we take the standard outline, we look at what the client needs, we combine our real-world experience with what the client needs and what the core outline is, and we come up with a customization of the outline so that you can get a more optimal result. And I know that Luan's been doing quite a bit of work with all kinds of different languages in TDD. In fact, what language are you doing this month?
Oh, this is horrible. I have to clean up some Fortran for a company.
What? Did you say Fortran? So in any case, it is, we looked at something very specific here with ASP.NET MVC, but it's just a tiny window into the expertise that Llewellyn has around testing and helping your developers understand testing. So even if MVC is not sort of your thing, I do recommend that you look at ApprovalTests, and if you have deeper training needs, that you reach out to Developmentor, which is just www.develop.com, so that you can talk with them about getting Llewellyn's expertise on site for you.
And then finally, you can always give me questions directly as well. You can find my Twitter at LuanFalco and my blog at luanfalco.blogspot. That's everything we have for today. Let me just do one quick check. Could an extension method be used? Sorry, this was asked earlier and I wasn't paying attention. So the answer is no. And the answer is you can't use an extension method because of this scenario that we're testing in, where it's actually in a completely separate space. So the extension method doesn't work because you can't tell it to call it. And in fact, this space here doesn't know about this space and can't know because you have a circular referential integrity issue, right? Because unit tests would reference your MVC project, and your MVC project would be referencing your unit tests. There's some talk that there might be a way to do this through IOC injection, and we've been expanding on that and exploring it lately, but we haven't yet come up with a satisfactory method to implement it. All right. Well, that's all we have for tonight. Hopefully you're having a good time, and you can go back to your current projects and start getting them under test and start getting them to be happier and cleaner, and just a more confident feeling that you have when you have code that you know actually works. That's all it is for me. Happy testing. Have a good day.